Transgender and gender nonconforming people have been the victim of a silent crime. Throughout history, the screams of the oppressed have always been silenced to make way for the expansion of the glorious nation-state. No action should be questioned, no matter how morally abhorrent, if it serves to benefit the state. However, it seems that these actions have always been pointed at specific groups. People of color, queer, and disabled folk alike have always been the victims of the state in its endless conquest for power. In response to this oppression, multiple groups have arisen in order to challenge the very function of the state. As to these groups, the state serves as nothing more than an unnecessary tool of abject violence. However, one of the more unique forms of these anarchistic groups is the movement of trans-anarchism, or Tranarchism. This movement is predicated on the belief that any manifestation of the state seeks to demonize and erase queer and trans folk from the margins of history, as queerness will always serve as a means to destabilize the state and its means of categorization. This video will not only attempt to analyze Tranarchism as a movement, but prove that this state serves only as a means to oppress those who do not conform to its values. Before I continue, I would like to extend my utmost thanks and gratitude to my dearest comrade, who has graciously written and narrated the first section of this video. Without her extended help and suggestions, this video would have been impossible. Thank you, Saph. You've been an amazing help.
It is important to analyze the ways in which the state attempts to control and surveil identity in regards to the people locked under its control. The state uses a form of monopolization on the very concept of identity to enforce modes in which those who do not fit within the lines of gender, race, sexuality, etc., as deemed viable or acceptable by the state apparatus, that being of the cisgendered straight white male, to have the burden of negotiating their very right of existence to the state. The idea being that the state is able to define who is and is not transgendered, who is and is not cleared to undergo affirming procedures, exponentially so within gender non-conforming spheres, in which they are forced to convince said psychiatrists that they exhibit symptoms of gender dysphoria, all for the ability to gain the bodily autonomy to have the affirming alterations they desire. These manifestations of identity policing and even erasure are not tied strictly to states of the imperial and bourgeois powers. A state, regardless of how revolutionary, is equally as prone to target queer life. Within the confines of the Soviet Union, the state used identity to have gay people criminally sanctioned and defined it as a psychosexual disorder, demonstrates that this form of state-sanctioned identity is not an exclusive trait to the bourgeois system. These are not symptoms by which the state existence is contributing to the oppression of minority and trans groups, but rather a tool that the state uses to legitimize and paternalize its existence as the progenitor of your existence. While the argument may be made that these cases were negligible or a product of their time, as this took place long before the sexual revolution. However, the case lies in the fact that the state did and does use its power to erase queer identity, and no system should ever have the ability to strip away or force one to justify something as basic as bodily autonomy. The identity of queer folk should not be at risk for the sake of self-satisfying bureaucracies to exercise power. These should be considered tools of violent oppression and rejected. Bureaucratic agencies use these categorizations to make decisions regarding the distribution of population-specific services and interventions by designing and interpreting classifications of who should and should not be eligible to receive services. These modes of inside/outside separation and analysis of groups and individuals are necessary in order for the state to exist as arbiter and caretaker. The effect this has on trans people is felt in everyday discourse, from the attempted erasure of trans identity in the United States, where Trump used the aforementioned state-sanctioned identity to legally erase trans identities in late 2018, is the most recent example in mind of this. To quote Ellis L. Herman, "The surveillance of transgender bodies is compound in intensity and complexity because of its occurrence at intersections of legal, medical, and social marginalization. In undertaking social and medical transition, transgender people must continually traverse borders of disclosure/concealment and visibility/invisibility. Trans people interface with the state for official correction and validation of gender on documents. Simultaneously, however, trans people are forced to negotiate interactions with the state, law, and medicine with fear and suspicion, because their bodies confound the constructed notions of binary sex/gender that maintain institutional power."
Now that we have analyzed the specific means in which the state seeks to control and surveil those under it, specifically trans people, it's quite clear that the only world possible for us is a world without a state to strip us of our autonomy and our identities. Because it's quite clear that a state will never have the interests of queer folk in mind, only their destruction and erasure to better maintain and solidify itself as an arbiter of life. It is here that a more comprehensive form of anarchism is needed to properly address and account for the lives of marginalized bodies under the state, as most discourse fails to account for these groups in general. This is where Tranarchism can be especially helpful in our understandings and codification of our discourse into praxes. Firstly, it is crucial to analyze what Tranarchism exactly is and how it can be manifested into praxes and state resistance. Tranarchism can be best defined as the usage of gender transgression as a tool to destabilize and challenge the state. Gender transgression, then, acts as a means to reveal the fallacies of the state, and inspire others to question the functions of the state and how it attempts to codify and belittle all identity deemed non-normative. This consciousness of truly fluid identity, and how it is constricted under the state, and how each person is affected individually by capitalism based on their identity, is absolutely crucial in our conquest against hierarchy, as without accounting for the vast array of institutions that the state expresses itself through, we risk reverting back to dominance and hierarchy post-revolution. Ellis Herman speaks about this in detail, and about how Tranarchism is essential in avoiding this pitfall of anarchism. Quote, "In the words of Audre Lorde, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. These words of revolution should be central to the ways anarchists develop and do praxes. The master, or the complex web of hegemonic power, created by the symbiotic interactions of capitalism and the state, uses strategies of dominance to ensure a docile population. Though power is expressed through an unimaginable number and variety of exchanges, it becomes institutionalized and hegemonic in the forms of racism, ableism, classism, ethnocentrism, sexism, heterosexism, homophobia, cissexism, and transphobia, and other modes of oppression. These are the tools of the state. When we engage in discourse and implement praxis that does not explicitly work to dismantle all, and not simply some of these oppressions at their intersections, we continue to use the master's tools in attempts to destroy the concept of mastery. For anarchism to truly carry the promise of justice, it must reject discourses rooted in dominance." End quote. Here, the true burden of anarchism, or any truly revolutionary movement for that matter, is revealed. We must not strive towards the end of only one form of power, such as the state, or capitalism, or fascism, but the ends of all forms of hierarchy that serve to erase and destroy life under it. This is especially important because where most revolutionaries fail in their discourse is in their assumption that the state doles out violence on an equal level, and that there is only a monolithic working class that suffers this violence in a purely identical fashion. To base discourse off of this is to deny how the state has historically targeted specific groups that threaten its existence or question its power. People of color have been the primary targets of imperial states, as their lives are viewed as less valuable than the expansion of the nation-state. Trans folk are denied life-affirming medication and validation simply because they do not conform to the state's definition of normalcy when it comes to gender binaries. We as anarchists and revolutionaries have an obligation to account for the lives and experiences of these oppressed groups in order to align ourselves with the correct side of history and equip ourselves with the knowledge we need to destroy the state. Of course, all of this could be simply brushed off as conjecture or armchair theory, as with no empirical examples of this Tranarchism, it can be very hard to shape ourselves in a cohesive manner. And as such, I would be very remiss if this was the reason people were to dismiss it. This is where I will recount the actions of two infamous queer revolutionaries, Sylvia Brevera and Marsha P. Johnson, and their creation of the Star Movement. Of course, most people would know these two queens of color from their actions at Stonewall, where Marsha and Johnson were both responsible for kicking off and leading one of the most influential and violent queer liberation protests in the West. However, I would not cite the Stonewall movement as specifically anarchistic today, as this movement has been effectively co-opted and diluted by the state to be projected and rerun in the annals of history as nothing more than a diluted protest for queer rights, rather than an act of queer insurrection. What I would posit as specifically anarchistic in nature would be the creation of the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, or STAR. This group, created by Marcia and Sylvia, served two unique purposes that I believe are important for our analysis here. First, STAR was created in opposition to mainstream LGBT rights movements that strive for nothing more than liberal reformism and a tolerance of queerness under the state that would serve to do nothing but reify oppression against them. Second, STAR created spaces where trans youth could live and exist freely without the penalization of the state harming them. The latter action here strikes as particularly revolutionary, as the creation of spaces outside of the state serves strictly to subvert the anti-queer tendencies of the state and its unnecessary criminalization of trans youth. While Johnson and Rivera may not have labeled themselves as anarchists, their practice should be used as a solid blueprint for our Tranarchist movements in the future. Using the road these revolutionaries paved for us, the manifestation of ourselves against the state is not only possible, but inevitable, and a manifestation against the state that is inclusive for all identities. We have been exiled to the margins of society. We queers have been deemed unworthy of life, and so the self-proclaimed arbiter of death seeks to strip us of our ontological being, our sense of living and identity. In our roles as nomads of society, we have realized that society has nothing to offer us but pain and exclusion. No action carried out by the state can serve to benefit the lives of poor trans people. No righteous action can manifest in the validation for our identities, because our identities prove that the state is weak and dying, a panicking institution that serves to instill docility and violence. Our identities show the state and must assign a cultural normalcy to justify its very existence. The state assures people that division and categorization is of the utmost priority to move society forward, while using these divisions to maintain and reify oppressive structures. Without the state, the need for a normative identity shall vanish. The state shall no longer exist in a panoptic fashion where it can view and control our bodies, and we will flourish as a result. Traditional thoughts on gender roles and binary thoughts on sex and gender will no longer serve a purpose and will slowly dissolve. This is because the state is one of the few proponents of these structures, because it is the only institution that creates and maintains false identities and spikes tensions between them. This is because, of course, the state needs its citizens to fight against one another through divisions of identity that it has created to ensure that nobody will realize the true violences of its actions. We revolutionary queers must take up banners left by our ancestors and charge forward into a new millennium. The world serves no purpose for us here, and we are obligated to tear it to the ground.